We're currently witnessing often violent protests in countless countries across the world. People are talking about a new global political awakening. But what do the protesters have in common, and where will the angry uprisings lead? Outrage over corrupt regimes, a yearning not to be shut out economically or politically. People want justice and they want freedom. It may only be minor grievances that trigger a movement, but the impact can be huge and it might even change our world. So our question is, protests across the globe talking about a revolution? Thanks very much indeed for joining us here on To The Point. And here with me in the studio today are Raghida Bahnam from Lebanon, who says we are witnessing a global youth rebellion not seen since 1968. And people in the Middle East are finally breaking the fear barrier. Also with us is Noack from the Washington Post, who argues that protesters share their frustrations with political systems that don't work in their favour, but the solutions to their concerns often differ vastly. And a warm welcome too to Jannis Grimm, Research Associate at the Institute for Protest and Social Movement Studies here in Berlin, who believes that the global protests underline the level of frustration among younger generations about the failure of elites to come up with answers to the problems of our time. Thank you all three for being here today once again. I'm going to begin with Raghida, and we can make a list of countries that are taking part in these uprisings, these protests, Hong Kong, Lebanon, Catalonia, Chile, for example, Iraq, for example. I could go on with an endless almost list. There are a lot of people who think that these movements and these protests have something in common, that they overlap, that they have something in common. Let's stick with that. Do you agree?
Well, they do have something in common, actually more than one thing. Maybe firstly, it's led by young people and it's leaderless. I mean, in all those places, we have not, or most of those places, we have not seen protests led by leaders or led by people who are telling those young people to demonstrate, to go on the streets and to demand. Each one maybe are demanding different things, but they're all on the street, angry, wanting the political elite to listen to their demands. But yeah, they're all young, they all want better future for themselves, and they're not following any leader.
And the unrest is spreading in the Arab world too, reminiscent of the Arab Spring nearly a decade ago. To what extent do you see this as something new and different, possibly something even more potent?
Well, I would say it's very different from what happened in what was called the Arab Spring, because if we look at what's happening in Iraq and Lebanon now, for example, people for the first time are going out on the street, not for support of the political leaders, but actually against them. I mean, we see people who in Lebanon, who used to go on the street in support of Hezbollah, who are now protesting against Hezbollah, who used to go on the street in support of Rafi al-Hariri, the Sunni prime minister, are now, or they were demanding his resignation and he resigned. And the same with the Christian leaders. And in Iraq as well, we see people asking the leaders that they elected a few months ago to resign and, to elect a new government that does not have anything to do with political figures, but bureaucrats.
And Noack, well, let's talk once again just for a moment about the common factors. I've got one expert who says that this has got to do with elites worldwide failing to give people the feeling that they can look forward to a life of hope and self-respect. Is that the common denominator that you see?
There certainly is that element. A lot of especially younger people feel fed up with essentially political systems or structures that were imposed on them, sometimes years ago, sometimes decades ago, which they feel do no longer work for them, essentially. And what's also interesting, I think, is that in a lot of cases, those protesters do not necessarily identify with a political party. They do not feel represented by political parties any longer. And that's certainly something I've observed, also looking at Latin America, for instance, apart from the Middle East.
And Jannis, just pick up on that point, if you would. A global change movement is what is being described, a period of flux not seen for decades. Does that capture the zeitgeist?
Yeah, I'm a bit uneasy about that notion that basically we're seeing something completely new and nothing has been going on in the last years, basically. So I think that is part of the truth, and we're definitely seeing a spike of protests in parts of the world that were not affected by protests in the past, such as some of the republics that were somehow missed by the Arab Spring, let's put it like that. But then, at the same time, also with that new attention on some of the hotspots comes also more attention, more media attention to other hotspots in the world, which kind
absolutely.
of, so it spirals up into, into a media frenzy of protests across the world.
But is it just a media frenzy? Because the media, but many other people, ordinary people that I've been meeting in recent weeks, are saying we're approaching some kind of tipping point. Is that plausible?
I think people are empowered by the pictures they see from other parts of the world. That are televised on they come to their home screens, they appear in their social media, they see what is happening there, and suddenly there's a shift of mindset. There's the impression maybe we could try something alike here, and maybe some of the recipes for the same problems that we have, social injustice, corruption, etc. Maybe some of these recipes might as well work in our context. So I think there's a powerful contagion element, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all a global movement, because in the end it's multi-causal. I think the factors that drive these protests.
Rick, you are nodding.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, because obviously we always tend to draw comparisons, and that's helpful, especially when it comes to trying to look for solutions, like what can we learn from other countries, how to respond to this, or how to address those demands. But at the same time, Barcelona and what's been happening there is hardly comparable to what's happening in Iraq, right?
Nevertheless, commentators have been pointing to US presidential advisor and academics, Zbigniew Brzezinski, talking a few years ago about a global political awakening. That notion of an awakening is very optimistic about what we're seeing. Do you share that kind of optimism?
Well, I would say this is more a backlash against deteriorating conditions. It's not necessarily an awakening in a sense. I think 10 years ago or a few years ago, we saw people being inspired by progress and them protesting because they wanted to be part of it and they felt left out. I think what we're seeing in a lot of places now is actually quite different. It's more a backlash against things getting worse for them and for their countries overall.
I think people are getting emboldened when they see other people in other countries where it wasn't thought about that they could go on the streets and protest against their leaders. They're doing it, and they start thinking, well, if they're doing it, maybe we can do it. I mean, the protests, if we take an example between Iraq and Lebanon, the demonstrators were holding banners saying, well, we salute the protesters in Iraq, and so the other way around. Also in Iraq, they were saying we salute the protesters in Lebanon. So when the people in Lebanon saw that the people in Iraq are on the streets, actually trying to burn the Iranian embassy because they feel that Iran is interfering in their affairs, and is one of the reasons why it's holding the country back. So the people who support Hezbollah in Lebanon, in its fiefdom in the south, thought, okay, if they're doing that, well, maybe we can also voice our opinion and go on the street and demand, better living for us. I mean, the situation in Iraq and Lebanon is still not comparable in terms of violence that Iraq has seen. But there's always this danger that things can slide out of control. But definitely, there's this link that people see each other, especially in the social media age, where everything is posted immediately and people can, send each other pictures of what's happening, and they can follow on Facebook and Twitter what's going on. So people do feel emboldened by that.
OK, we've got 3 examples of the moment in each instance when outrage and despair boil over into protest and sometimes into violence.
Chile. A 4-cent hike in subway fares triggered mass protests. President Sebastián Piñera, a billionaire, was made a scapegoat. When images surfaced of Piñera dining in an expensive restaurant, protesters blamed the government for the ever-widening gap between rich and poor. Lebanon. Tens of thousands took to the streets to condemn a 20-cent per day fee the government planned to impose on telephone calls over the internet. In late October, Prime Minister al-Hariri resigned. But the protests continued. Now they're directed against the government's economic policies, corruption and inflation. France. Every Saturday, tens of thousands across the country protested against a 7-cent increase in fuel prices. After 2 months, the government rolled back the price increases. Here too, the demonstrations have continued, taking aim at social inequalities. In spring 2019, the movement lost steam after President Emmanuel Macron initiated a national debate. Are people today more willing to fight for their rights?
Well, that's a good question, but there, Jannis, it was all about grievances surrounding mobility and communication. What does that tell us about the movements that we're sort of witnessing at this point in time?
I would say that it's often, the triggers are often maybe not only mobility and telecommunications, but basically public service provisions, basically. So it's because these are sectors where corruption is rampant in many parts of the world, and where all kinds of social classes are affected in a way by this. So basically, and especially the ones that are anyway the disenfranchised of the globalization and of liberal economic reforms and so on. So what I think is, or what I believe is we see in large parts of the world, maybe not in Barcelona and in Hong Kong, because there's different motives behind the protest, is that it's a return of the social question in combination with corruption, basically. And this is like a very explosive mixture, basically. You have a certain fertile ground that is the grievances of people that are the losers, let's say, of globalization. And then there's these transformative events, they're called in social movement research, basically, that make blatantly obvious the disparities between the walk and talk of the elite, basically, and that show blatantly obvious to everyone that those in power are not, managing the country for their good, for the people's good, but for their own, in a way. And I think the cases that were mentioned here are obvious examples for that, but you could as well add Indonesia to that, or you could add Peru to that, where actually attempts to disempower anti-corruption agencies and so on were the trigger for protests. So it's this motive of corruption is returning over and over and over in these protests. So I think this is one of the most common denominators of these protests across the world, basically.
Rick, you have been writing on these same questions. What have you discovered?
Well, what I think we have discovered is essentially what you just said. Sort of the this inequality, social discontent is certainly driving tensions in a lot of countries. But then, at the same time, I think one of the more interesting discoveries is sort of how people have been trying to deal with it, how they've responded to this. And one interesting example I've seen over the last few days has actually been Chile, where people have realized that with this government, they might not be able to achieve what they want, which is a new constitution, essentially. And they've come together in thousands of sort of small town hall meetings, which they've organized themselves, or that have been organized by soccer clubs or other institutions, where they themselves have tried to develop solutions. And I think those initiatives and those ideas are quite interesting to observe, and they're happening in a number of countries right now.
Okay, so community and equality are very important issues, very important tropes in what is going on. How much, and you mentioned this earlier, Raghida, how much is this an age war?
Well, it is pretty much an age war, because the gap between rich and poor is widening all over the world, or in a lot of countries, even in the United States and even in communities in Europe. It's not widening to the same degree as in many other countries where we're seeing the protests. Like in Chile. Chile is one of the most, is one of the richest Latin American countries.
Huge inequality.
But the inequality is massive in it. And the same, we were talking about the Gilets jaunes protests in France. Who are those people who were protesting? A lot of them were people from the banlieue who are of immigrant descent, who are Algerians who went to Paris. If you go to Paris now and you cross to the banlieue in the metro, in the underground, you immediately know that you arrived to the banlieue, because you can tell when you walk on the street that it's the banlieue, because it's been left, to decay. It's collapsing. You can tell that people are unemployed. People don't know what to do. The social inequality is massive there, and. Well, the same goes in Lebanon and Iraq. Those are two countries that don't have electricity. Iraq is an oil-rich country that people don't have electricity now, and the same in Lebanon. It's the level of difference between rich and poor is widening, and it's scary, and poor people cannot put up with it, even if you tell them it's 20 cents on a phone call, when you are the country that pays one of the highest bills on cellular phones, and you come and strip them this right of making a free call that's been given to them. It's a universal, they are going to get angry, and they are going to go on the streets, and things lead to other things.
Jannis.
Yeah, I think it's completely right what you just said, and I mean, what turns these, I mean, you could have discontent with the political system in any part of the world, but and you certainly have that in democracies as well. You have protests all over the place, but what I think turns these current protests into larger social movements and to larger mass uprisings, if you will, is that there's a frustration basically with the mechanisms, or with a lack of responsivity of the political systems where these protests takes place. So people on the street, and there's a parallel actually with movements like Extinction Rebellion in Germany, where the people on the street, they have no trust anymore that the political systems that are in place to govern them basically can provide solutions for the problems that they see,
and to what
like climate change.
And to what extent, when you talk about that kind of frustration, to what extent can anger, can violence even be the way to bring about change? To what extent is that acceptable? After all, we're sitting here in Germany, yes, the country that is so proud of its peaceful revolution that removed the Berlin Wall.
I mean, first of all, I think it's necessary to differ basically what kind of violence we're talking about. If we're talking about physical violence and violence or structural violence, which is basically the main driver that brings people to the street there in the first place. When we talk about physical violence at protest events themselves, sometimes also in response to policing measures, then there's basically the evidence is mixed in research. There's been very little evidence that suggests that violent revolutions are generally more successful than non-violent ones. And the opposite is now true as well. There's been a very contentious book by Erica Chenoweth that came out lately that basically contests this thesis of the non-violent revolution as the more successful way. I think, in a way, it's not steerable anyway that much. Often these violent incidents happen out of situational dynamics where things go out of hand. In Lebanon, yesterday, a protester was shot and killed overnight. This might very well be an event that spirals out of control. In Hong Kong, a protester was shot in a melee with police on the street. This was certainly not planned or premeditated, but this stuff can trigger spirals that end up in violent uprisings at one point. So I think that there's a limited ability of social movements to control their followers. To a certain extent, they're doing that, and I think it's remarkable that actually most of these protests are non-violent right now, and it's still remarkably peaceful in a way. Okay, despite repression sometimes.
Raghida?
I just wanted to say that one of the reasons why those protests, or some of them are turning into violence, is that the international order is kind of broken down. I mean, we have the United States that is the leader of the world, that's been quiet on most of those things, on most of those conflicts. I mean...
Very important point, because it had for so long been a flagship of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, people wait for the United States to see what they have to say about those conflicts. And when the United States is not saying anything, is not calling for the government in Iraq to, reform, is not calling on the government of Lebanon to listen to the people, is not, when we have this silence, so those governments feel empowered to fight back their people. And this will obviously lead to violence, because the people feel they're not being heard and they want to escalate, and, that's when things get out of control.
Interesting comments. Now let's have a look now at two countries that have gone in different directions in recent times. Change thwarted in one of the countries, change to a certain extent at least realised in the other.
The 2011 Arab Spring began in Tunisia and spread to Egypt. After weeks of protests, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak resigned. He ruled for nearly 30 years. He was tried on corruption charges. Newly elected Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi set about establishing a strict religious regime. After 1 year, he was ousted by a military coup. In 2014, former Defense Minister El Sisi became president. He ordered thousands arrested and democratic organizations crushed. Many Egyptians are calling the regime worse than Mubarak's, and they're taking to the streets. A ray of hope appeared in Sudan. After over 3 decades of ruthless domination and months of protests, Sudanese dictator Omar al-Bashir was ousted by the country's military. Following continued bloodshed, the Military Council and Opposition Forces for Freedom movement signed an agreement regulating the division of power between military and civilian authority. The first democratic elections are to be held within 3 years. Is it the military that decides success or failure of a revolution?
Big, important question. Another question that is related to that, Jannis, you are smiling a little bit. It's a very broad question I'd like to give you. How do you best move from anger and despair to sustained, constructive change?
That's the $1 million question in a way, right? I mean, that's the holy grail of transition studies. In a way, that's no guarantee for success, but those cases that have proven successful transitional countries to make their way towards democratization or to more open and more liberal systems of society, or post-conflict countries such as Lebanon or Iraq, dialogue basically and roundtables and bringing the stakeholders to the table and not only those with the guns basically has proven like a relatively successful recipe to mediate conflict and to keep it peaceful. And exclusion never works on the long run. It might work for a time, but repression actually remarkably well for a certain time, but it might backfire on the long run. So this exclusion, I don't have much hope that wherever people are excluded, that this will be sustainable.
And Rick, what role does leadership play in all this? I've seen, one comment we're experiencing at the moment a new age of leaderless revolution, as though that was something to be applauded, as though that were a good thing. But what happened to Mahatma Gandhi? What happened to Martin Luther King? What happened to Nelson Mandela? These are the kind of people, surely, that these movements could use.
Right. I guess the sort of advantage, or what people see as the advantage of leaderless movements, is that it can't be so easily perhaps abused by someone who is charismatic or wants to steer protest in a certain movement. But the risk, of course, is similar, that it can derail and perhaps people are no longer quite sure what they wanted to achieve in the first place. And then certain elements break out and violence erupts, as some have feared in Hong Kong, for instance. What is interesting, though, is that in a lot of those places where protests have been happening, for instance, in Iraq on Tahrir Square or in Lebanon, people have sort of come together on public spaces and tried to create a society they sort of envision in a small micro scale. And that is something really interesting, I think, because that is essentially leadership by living it and by showing the elite and the establishment what they have in mind.
Raghida, you touched on leadership earlier.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, because one of the main problems now is that whoever is in power does not want to give power. This is what, in Bolivia, when the president left and, went to Mexico, this didn't even come down because his step came late, because what he tried to do is that he tried to run for another election. He rigged the election, he won the election, he stayed in power, and this is what triggered the people. And we see that, yeah, of course, if you want to stay in power and if you want to stop those protests against you by force, what will happen? We had an example in Syria. President Bashar al-Assad attempted to, or did that, with the help of the Russians, which made things worse. But what's happened to Syria now? I mean, Syria now is a fractured country, is a country that would, if the war ends now, would take decades to recover. And, God knows how many refugees are going to be able to return to their country if that happens. So you can stay in power and you can crush the revolution, but at what price? At the price of losing your country as it is.
Jannis, I've got a quote for you, which I found extremely interesting this week. I was reading a commentator from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He wrote, "The risks and implications are mounting for governments, businesses and organisations. It's a question of when and not if the digital flash mob comes to those in power." How much should those in power be fearing the mob?
Well, I think that those in power have always feared the mob. What they're fearing now is social media, basically. I mean, that's what this quote also alleges to, basically, that, the digital connections that can be drawn between very, disparate people and also outside of this big urban centers, basically. This is a very empowering component of social media. That's also why so many in power are trying to control social media. And they're employing, bot armies, and they're using sophisticated means of digital surveillance and repression to get to those that organize protests and so on. So I think it's a two-edged sword. It's basically a continuation of, I think, the game that has been going on between the people and power holders, authoritarian ones, for decades, just that now a digital level, a digital arena has been added to that, basically.
Oh, we're running out of time. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. We've been talking about this global uprising here on To The Point. Thanks very much for joining us. Until next week, bye-bye and tschüss.